They just get straight to the point. Is South Africa going to be okay?
There's these deep societal trends which are backed up by the data that have pushed this in this direction.
Will this GNU survive come 2029? Is the DA on top? Is the ANC on top? As long as that is the case, then South Africa's prospects of being successful in the fullness of time are considerable, which is absolutely essential if South Africa's Jewish community is going to survive. Don't do this. If the GNU breaks up now, don't think now we're at the end. This is it. That is wrong. It's an analytical mistake. Do you think expropriation is a good idea? 20% of ANC voters, I think it might be 25 or 26, think it's a good idea. The rest don't. Why?
If it fell apart, what would that mean for the prospects of the country?
That is something you do not take for granted. We are very, very fortunate.
The country needs to do better, but it will do better if we all join that struggle and fight and make our voices heard and have a sense to say, let's build a better country together. Part of the purpose of this conversation is really to have a look at South Africa from a rational perspective. Let's see, what do the facts say? What do the numbers say? What does the analysis say? And from there, that empowers us to really respond appropriately to the challenges and the opportunities of this historic time that we're living through. So Frans, welcome. It's great to be with you. And I think a great place to start is 1 year ago, we were sitting in this office, and at the time, you made some very bold predictions about how the elections were going to play out and the prospects of a GNU that no one had even was speaking about. So let's go back 1 year and see what you said then and what happened, and then we'll move into looking towards the future again.
Well, we had good information. I mean, that's the critical thing. We had very good political data that was being produced by South Africa's Social Research Foundation. So we knew the numbers and we knew the election result. We knew that the ANC was going to come in below 50%. And we also had enough to know that there was a lot of interest in the idea of the ANC and the DA getting together after the fact. So at the time, still quite an alien concept a year out. The sort of mainstream cliche kind of B-grade media was still holding up the idea that the two parties' supporters were so at odds with each other, almost adversaries, enemies, that it's completely impossible that the parties would drag these recalcitrant supporters together into a unity government. Now that was, of course, completely false, because it had been straightforward enough to establish that the deal between the DA and the ANC was the most popular political deal in the country. It had been that for a long period of time, and the parties would have had no difficulty at all in bringing their supporters along if the leadership were able to find each other. We were also of the view that those discussions between leadership had been continuing for some time, actually I think quite a considerable time, before we even got to the May election of last year. So the big calls were the ANC loses and a unity government is formed in the aftermath. And on both calls, we were essentially correct.
Yes, and I think this point that you made, the discrepancy between, say, perhaps the sort of elite legacy media perspective of things, which sees the supporters of the DA and the ANC with divergent interests and wishes and opinions about things. And actually, what I think has emerged so powerfully from your data, which then supported the idea of a GNU, is a wide national consensus across 70-80% of the population that supports a moderate approach to what's happening in the country, and the GNU is an expression of that.
Yeah, I continue to say to you and to people who watch this, they just get straight to the point. Is South Africa going to be okay? The most powerful countervailing force in favour of the country's success is the good sense of its people. Public opinion in South Africa is moderate, pragmatic and centrist. It has been that for a very long period of time, despite the history, despite the extraordinary levels of economic exclusion that extend into the present. Officially, the unemployment rate is 30%. Amongst young people, it's 50%. If you want to take it to its highest number, take a young black woman, the unemployment rate goes to above 70%. Now, despite that, and despite the country's history, and despite the amount of incitement that comes out of parts of the media and out of parts of the political spectrum, Comfortably, 7 out of 10 South Africans, as we talk, I'll take you into some of those numbers, are on the same side with each other. They want essentially the same thing for themselves, for their families, for their children, for their grandchildren. They want to live in a successful and prosperous and democratic society. And almost most important of all, they agree in the main on the policies that a South African government would need to pursue for that to happen. So do not fall for the deception that South Africa is a deeply divided society in which different groups of political orientation or ideology or class or history or race or whatever the case is are so invested against each other that cliche is at all true of wishing to chase each other into the sea. That's wrong, and it remains absolutely wrong. It remains wrong almost a year into the GNU. The reason, in the main, why we may still become a very successful society is the good sense of the great majority of the country's people.
Right. Let's unpack that for a moment. But just before, I think is that the critical framing of what you're saying is that many people tend to see the country in racial terms. So let's say the elite within media or the ANC, or even we've seen in elements of the Trump administration looking through a racial prism at South Africa and saying this is about black versus white, whereas in fact there is a broad consensus across all races, 70-80% what you call pragmatic policies, and then maybe let's unpack what those mean when you say that, pragmatic, centrist, moderate. What do you mean when you say that?
You know, more than 20 years ago, I was very fortunate to be trained, is probably the right way to put it, by a number of people, and one who was very influential was Professor Lawrence Schlemmer, who was a pioneer of the social research and sort of polling industry in the country. Schlemmer was a most remarkable man, and he said to me, going back into the 80s even, so we were 45, 50 years ago, if you polled South Africans on questions of values, even at the heart of apartheid, and you didn't tell the person, if you'd asked a black South African or a white South African the question, it was very difficult to tell the difference between the two. Because the values, the broad sense of how the world should be and what's important to people was already so close-knit, despite the horrors of that political system and the deep economic inequalities. Now that had obviously a great impression on one. And I've looked at or polled on South Africa for 20 years. And it remains true every single time. So let's get past the theory of it. Hard practice. One of the issues that's been prominent in South Africa's media of late is the chant of kill the boer, kill the farmer. Now, before we came into the room here, I called the SRF guys just outside and said, what's the latest data on that? And it's remarkable. They show that 8 out of 10 South Africans think that is an offensive, unacceptable way to speak or act or suggest things. In the ANC camp, amongst ANC supporters, 70% strongly opposed to the idea that this is a legitimate way to behave or act or speak towards your fellow South Africans. Now that's quite at odds with the impression that's sometimes created in the mainstream, that there's this body, the substantive body of opinion that's sort of filled with hate and anger and the pursuit of vengeance. And remarkable considering the history of the country that it's not so. And the chap I spoke to outside now, I said, well, give me some numbers on the EFF. And the amazing thing, I think he said to me, in the EFF camp, it splits 83% against the idea that it's acceptable. And just let's take a little route into that. How is that possible? That the EFF is this hateful, vengeful party of violence and anarchy. Supporters within the EFF, so it's a very good example of the broader point I'm making, are often people who have no prospects, young people, no prospects, no hope at all. They were at rubbish schools, they got an education that doesn't prepare them for finding employment. They're the victims of this massive youth unemployment figure that I've cited for you. They're never going to get a job. They have no esteem in society, so they're drawn to something And they're drawn to that radical populist party. But the person, if you drill down into that person's beliefs and values, create for them just the basic opportunity to be successful, to find work, to look after their own families, to raise children in a safe neighborhood. You're not dealing with an individual who is a spite-driven, a vengeful, racial nationalist maniac. You're just often dealing with a kid who's been in the most appalling circumstances you can imagine, their whole life, with no hope of anything better. And when they look through the political spectrum, there's not much that they see. But that individual, in the main, is a person that if you afford them the opportunities at a better life, are people who still essentially share the same value. So you could say even within the EFF camp, just to make the extreme case of it, the body of public opinion in South Africa is moderate. Let's go to another example. Expropriation is a big issue. The government cast this around.
Just on that kill the Boer, what I just a side point on it with the Constitutional Court decision where they dismissed AfriForum's application even for leave to appeal. Now, sometimes judges are playing to the politics of the society, and I think this is an important point for these judges to hear. Firstly, on the law, how do you dismiss something with no right to appeal? But secondly, because this is clearly arguable, but secondly, you got your politics wrong. Because actually the politics of the country is that most South Africans, 70-80%, are against this. And so I just think this is important because that judgment emerged from the conventional wisdom of the elite within politics, within media, saying actually, this is where the disgruntled majority of the country sits. So I think it's what you're saying is very important for the whole functioning of society to actually understand the data.
Look, you can make a free speech argument. The EFF are free to chant whatever they wish, short of the direct consequence of violence being applied to a person. And whatever caused the court to come to its conclusions, what's plain to see is that those conclusions are at odds with the values of the very great majority of South Africa's people.
Yes. Sorry, I interrupted you. Give another example.
Go to the question of expropriation. Supposedly, if you were to read the mainstream, the greatest desire of the great majority of South Africa's people is for the state to expropriate everything and redistribute it. It doesn't work. Inside the ANC base, this is Social Research Foundation data, fairly fresh. Do you think expropriation is a good idea? 20% of ANC voters, I think it might be 25 or 26, think it's a good idea. The rest don't. Why? Because they do not trust the ANC to do it. They believe it's a fundamentally corrupt party. But more than that, the aspiration, after being denied property rights for generations, is actually to own your own property, not to have a state that expropriates it from others and then through the state tries to parcel it around. South Africans are shrewd enough to know that is ineffective, simply a door to further state capture and corruption.
Yes, and millions of South Africans are denied property rights, black farmers who are on land. Yes.
Today still, yes. There's a remarkable figure. We've been in America, but talking to some Americans in the aftermath of some of Mr. Trump's comments. And one of the points we made to them on property rights is that do not think that the expropriation threat is a threat that is focused or applies to white South Africans. Across the fertile east of the country, we judge that more than half of all agricultural land by value is in black possession, but it's not in black ownership because the state denies individual ownership rights to within many black communities. And so before you get to the question of expropriation of white commercial farmers, it applies, of course, equally to black commercial farmers, know that there are already millions of people who continue to be denied under a democratic administration basic rights to property, and that our suggestion should be something the US administration is aware of when it looks at South Africa. So expropriation's unpopular. I had breakfast this morning with a chap called Dr. John Endres. He runs the Institute of Race Relations, and their sort of great historical theme, I suppose, is the idea of race relations in the country. And I asked him if they had any numbers on the employment equity amendments that are being pushed by the Labour Department that the DA is now challenging in the courts. Now, these would set quite strict targets. There's a silly debate about the difference between a quota and a target.
Yeah, but before you say what he says, that's being set up at the moment by the ANC and many elements within the legacy media to say this is about the DA opposing the true transformation of the country.
Well, that's one of we're going to get to this point. But
Yes.
just where is this? Because the first thing one must get past is the impression created the ANC is doing this through the Labour Ministry because there is a vast demand for this sort of thing. And John was able to show me this morning off his laptop that if you ask people how appointments should be made in the country on the basis of race until we're demographically representative and the like, I think the figure is under 20% of the ANC's own voters think that is the way to do it. With the great bulk, I think in the ANC case it was 73%, is the number I remember, saying appointments must be made on the grounds of merit alone and on nothing else. Now there is if you are entirely exposed to a set of arguments which suggest that broad public opinion is driven by these sort of ideological and sometimes sort of quite aggressive radical concerns, this strikes you as extraordinary. How is it possible that in the ANC base people are opposed to this sort of thing in the main? And the reason is that all it needs actually, a lot of South Africa, the great missing link, I suppose, is just basic common sense to understand how the society is evolving. If you live in a desperately poor community, you are disproportionately exposed to the state for the services you receive, the access to healthcare or policing. You're not the elite middle classes who've privatized their way out of exposure to the state. And therefore the consequences of an appointment process that doesn't prioritize merit above all else has such a crippling and destructive effect on your life that the desperation for merit-based appointments are very great indeed. Now here something interesting begins to happen in the aftermath of the ANC's defeat last year. Why? We go back into that in a little moment as well, why the ANC actually lost. But in the aftermath, time and again, whether it's something like expropriation or whether it's something like the Employment Equity Act amendments, mainstream ANC policy is at odds, fundamentally misaligned with the interests of that party's own remaining, as they are, voters and supporters.
And didn't you find, just before the election, if I'm remembering correctly, on the NHI discussion, the ANC got it wrong again. It's this trend of like sort of speaking in the name of the people, but actually the people want something completely different.
I think there's a real break now between what people wish for, what ANC supporters wish for, and what the ANC is offering. And we saw that in NHI in the run-up to the election. Absolutely, the ANC stressed NHI terribly strongly in the latter stages of the election. It was aware that its number was headed into the low 40s, thought this would play as some sort of populist sort of idea and shore up support. What happened? It caved away down to the low 40% number.
The SRF showed actually from that announcement.
Yeah, because we were polling every single day, you must understand, into the election. We did it for a whole month. Every single day we'd test opinion again. And we could see as that rocket of we'll nationalise healthcare went up, ANC support alienated. Why? Because the same point. For many ANC voters come out of deplorable circumstances and horrible poverty. This is the first, now starting a second generation of access to world-class medical care. And a mistake I think the ANC often makes is it says, well, there are only so many of them, the great majority don't. But aspirations are something that the ANC seems to be unaware of. It's aspirational to live a comfortable, Western-style, middle-class standard of living. And in South Africa's case, access to world-class medical services is part of that. So when you, in a sense, promise to take that away, as a colleague of mine that we work closely with on the polling says, on many of these issues, the ANC has now for some time been running campaigns against itself and against its policies. And it's actually an extraordinary thing, to think that a party in this much trouble, with such low levels of support, continues to double down on policies that can only have the consequence of lowering that support further and further again. The most stunning example out of this year is the question of VAT. The ANC supporters en masse are strongly opposed to the idea of tax increases. Yet the ANC in government finds itself in a position where it's fronting a VAT increase. And the consequences for it are crippling. I'm now aware of 3 polls. One comes out of our camp, and 2 out of others, that show ANC support moving into the low 30s at times. Now that doesn't mean it can't move out of the 30s. This is not the prediction of the next election result. But it has moved into the low 30s this year because the party time and again positions itself at odds with the interests and aspirations of its remaining supporters. I just want to make the point quickly about why the ANC lost the election last year. It's absolutely simple. In its first decade and a bit in governance, the ANC does very well. It will double the number of people in employment. Through the years of Mandela and Mbeki, the ANC in government is recording 500,000 net new jobs per year. In the era of Mr. Zuma, it cuts that in half to 250,000. In the era of Mr. Ramaphosa, it cuts that in half again, more than in half. It goes to under 100,000 net new jobs per year. In the first decade and a bit after 94, take a number, 94, 49% of families go to bed without electricity. Just more than 10 years later, that's been brought down to 19%. But that number is now higher today than it was when Thabo Mbeki picked up his office. The reason the ANC lost the election last year is because its voters are motivated solely by their material circumstances, as all voters are. There's nothing great inside. There isn't a sort of profound insight into it's just common sense again. And the ideas of liberation, loyalty, voting. Of course, ANC voters had very strong ties to the party because they'd invested so much of themselves in the idea that the ANC would bring them dignity, which it did in many respects, and initially in government was very successful. But through that successful era, the party leadership, as I read it, was very aware of what the membership base and the voting base needed and wanted, which was real material improvements in living standards, and those were provided. As a consequence, by 2004, the ANC is stronger politically in an election than when Mandela led it and the country to liberation in 1994. What's happened subsequently, and it sounds terribly critical of the ANC, but it is, and partly for its own sake, is there's this chasm that's developed between what the public, the supporter base, wish for and what the party continues to offer. And as the support slips, the offers become increasingly radical when the demands are in fact increasingly moderate. And the fundamental lesson that the ANC taught South Africa in the last 30 years is that if you offer moderate, pragmatic policies that raise levels of business confidence, investment and growth, you are rewarded politically. If you turn radical and populist, the extent of the rate of that turn is very much related to the extent to which your political base is eroded in the country, and that continues to play out into this GNU.
Yes, in other words, democracy works. The system is working because it's being reflective of the will of the people based on their aspirations for life.
This is a very important point to make in any community, the Jewish community here, everywhere else. Nothing's gone wrong in South Africa. We haven't fallen off the precipice. We became a democracy 30 years ago, so that if a point was reached where the country wasn't well governed to the advantage of all its people, The people would do something about it. That's the entire point of the exercise. And it worked exactly like that. When the ANC performed well, it was rewarded. When it stopped performing well, turns radical. It gets absolutely smoked in that election of last year, and it continues to shed support into the present today. And South Africa is therefore, let's have a second countervailing force. One, we've said, in favour of success. Public opinion is moderate and pragmatic in the main. If you're the sort of normal, hard-working person, goes to work every day and tries everything you can to build the country and the communities around you, you are the average man or woman, as the case may be. You're not the exception. There's nothing wrong with you. You are it. As much as as social media and the like try and convince you otherwise. That's countervailing force number one. Countervailing force number two is we live in a society where the democracy works. Countries change in two ways, and there's no third. They change either peacefully but chaotically, as we are doing now, or they change violently, which means there's shooting in the streets. We are in the fortunate minority of post-colonial emerging markets where the change process is peaceful, democratic, if slightly chaotic. And I could brief you on the civil war in the Sudan. It's always the example I use. If you wish to see a situation out of which there's no easy escape. So moderate opinion and a democratic system that works. There's no need to run around looking for a reform movement, or who will do something is the cry. Will business drive reform? Will the government, will the diplomats? The people are doing it on their own to a spectacular extent that we've gone through an election where the ruling administration lost power and pretty meekly accepted the consequences and thought in the aftermath perhaps the best thing to do is to try and build a coalition government with our former political adversary. That is something you do not take for granted. We are very, very fortunate as a country that this is the point that we got to.
And it relates as well to your broader narrative point here, that decision to go into a coalition and build a government of national unity is an expression again of the will of the public. Didn't your SRF data show that actually that's what people wanted? They wanted the DA and the ANC to come together to hold a more moderate centre.
Yeah. And if we go a level below this, on the day of the election last year, where did parties get their votes from? So for the ANC, it got 40% of its votes from the urban periphery, so the sort of emerging township middle-class market. And it got 40% from traditional rural areas. And the balance it got from shack settlements and commercial farms and CBD. So 40% urban periphery, township political market, 40% rural. One of the things the ANC negotiators on the GNU, I think, understood was that if they double down on that rural market, they're done for. Because the older rural voting market is diminishing at the migration rate and the country's mortality rate. And to remain politically relevant in a future South Africa, the ANC needs to capture the imaginations, the aspirations of this emerging middle class. The DA on the day of the election got more than half of its votes from established suburbia. I think 20% from the township market, then a little bit elsewhere. And therefore this governing agreement we have, this GNU, it is a coalition between the DA and the ANC, of course. And there's a silly discussion about whether it's also a GNU, but it's a coalition. But more important than a coalition, it's a deal between two groups of citizens. The established middle classes in suburbia, black and white, and it's certainly very close to this, but I think I must think of the right number, but it's certainly very close to this. I think less than half of the DA's voters in this election were white. So, think about that. And so it's a deal between the established black and white middle classes in suburbia and the aspirant middle class on the urban fringe. And we're very fortunate that that is the deal, because both partners to the deal, the people that make up these two groups, their interests are exactly the same. Policies that secure the future of middle-class suburbia are the same policies that make possible the rise of new middle classes and therefore meet the aspirations. There's no other deal the country could have struck from a structural perspective where the interests of the different parties were as closely aligned as they are here. And therefore, even now, at 100 days into the GNU, 60% of South Africans said it was performing well. Now, you might think that's low. It's not low. For South Africans to think their government is performing well, 60% is a record high kind of a number. 200 days into the GNU, the 60% had become 50%. But the 50% was still twice as many as the 25% who thought the GNU was performing poorly. So the GNU remains popular. And this segues us perhaps into the sort of immediate angst-ridden question of, will this GNU survive? I think in the DA camp at the moment, commitment to the GNU is very, very sound, very, very deep. And I think within the ANC camp, there's confusion. But amongst core leadership figures, there's an understanding that the ANC needs this deal with the DA, it needs it to hold. But there is a rebellion on flanks of the ANC, within some of its committees and the like, who wish for the ANC to jettison the DA, to chuck it out of the government of national unity. And my sense of it is that it holds. But I qualify that by saying the extent to which some ANC leaders, who themselves have been guilty of inciting rebellion against the GNU, are able now to reverse the consequences of their own incitement and convince their colleagues to hold the GNU together. That's the question over whether it persists into the next year and the year beyond that, and then the election in 2029.
But if it fell apart, what would that mean for the prospects of the country? Like you're saying, balance of probabilities, it will hold, but politics is an uncertain space, and their personalities, and anything could happen. It could break apart next week. Unlikely, but let's say it does. What does that mean?
Straight up, it doesn't matter a lot now, all of which needs to be very heavily qualified. When the ANC performed so very well in government, and it doubled the number of people in employment, and it's had these amazing service delivery successes, none of which it was credited with. When it did that, underneath that, there were other trends, and we must read these now. One is that levels of investor confidence in South Africa was rising very quickly. And when investor confidence rises, levels of fixed investments, this hard capital contributed to the economy, as a share of GDP, you can measure the indicator, that was rising very strongly as well. And when that rises, the rate of economic growth lifted very strongly. So from 94 to, just pre-94 to, let's say the period 2000 to 2007-8, the economic growth rate, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in 98, the economic growth rate is lifting through 2 to 3 to 4 and then 5%. Levels of fixed investment are lifting from 15% of GDP into the low 20s and are starting to look like they can assault 25%, which is the emerging market average. The reason for that is that levels of investor confidence in the country, you measure these things in indices, are very sharply up. So all of that happened. Growth rates up, ANC stable. In the current GNU, which we are very fortunate to have, and it was a great success, and we can bank that, the investor confidence hasn't lifted as strongly as it should have. It is far off the levels we saw between 2000 and 2007. As a consequence of that, levels of fixed investment as a share of the size of the economy are again back to about 15%. Now, at 15%, fixed investment levels are consistent with the economy growing at 1%. But at 1% growth, we don't create many jobs at all. Now, the reason why confidence is low, investor confidence, is that many policies of the government remain such that the rest of the world is simply a more competitive investor destination. Whether this GNU holds together into the immediate future or not, that is not going to change. because the partners in the government are yet to reach a point where they can force balances of power that bring about the scale of policy reform necessary to raise investor confidence. So if this GNU breaks up now from a macro scale, South Africa's broader economic performance, the forecast 1% growth rate, that doesn't change by much. We're still going to be a low growth economy. We're still going to have low levels of confidence. We're still going to have low levels of job creation. ANC support is still going to be eroded as a consequence. All that will happen if the GNU breaks up now is the country's repriced, which means the bond market reprices itself because of the greater risk, and the currency moves accordingly to account for the risk as well. So don't worry about the immediate breakup. We will have several opportunities over the next number of years, let's say 10 years, where political events, the departure of Mr. Ramaphosa that will eventually happen, there's a local government election next year, there's the big one, the national government election in 2029. The DA picks new leadership, I think in April of next year as well. These will all be opportunities to rebuild new kind of governing coalitions. And the broader trends that have brought us to this point, where no party can comfortably command a national majority, given present economic performance, that's likely to remain the case. This is a transition phase that we're in. The countervailing forces, moderate public opinion, and the fact that the democracy works, these remain in play. And they will continue to create new opportunities for coalition. And have a little bit of patience with the politicians. If you think of the modern sort of South Africa as 400 years old, let's say, it has never been the case that whoever was in charge of any quarter of the country through that 400 years needed actually to settle with a partner and find a common position on policy. It's completely unique. We've only been doing it for 300 days out of 400 years. So that the GNU may break up, reformulate, break up, reformulate, that might be part of the process now. But the trends that brought us here, they continue. Public opinion remains moderate. The democratic system continues to work. We remain a country that changes chaotically and not violently. That is the argument about why you shouldn't think that, don't do this. If the GNU breaks up now, don't think now we're at the end. This is it. That is wrong. It's an analytical mistake. We will be back here rebuilding new GNUs at various intervals over the next several years.
Yes, and I think because the theme that's emerging, from what you're saying, is that sometimes people are looking at the surface. At the surface, there's a GNU. It looks like, well, that was just a deal cobbled together. You're showing underneath that there's people, but underneath those people is these deep societal trends which are backed up by the data that have pushed this in this direction. Those trends remain in place.
Yeah,
whether there's an expression of those trends practically.
You put it much better than I do. It doesn't matter if the politicians lose their minds and fight with each other and they walk away. The people and the common interests that are at the heart of this GNU deal, that remains even if the politicians have walked away from the deal. Yeah. And as long as that is the case, then South Africa's prospects of being successful in the fullness of time are considerable. I wouldn't be complacent. You can't have a 1% economic growth rate and a 30% unemployment rate and think that stays forever. You do need to confront threats when they emerge and fight them off. This isn't a laissez-faire, sit back, the public opinion will sort it out. It's simply to say that at this juncture, the balance of public opinion, the nature of the democratic system is such that South Africa's prospects of being successful through the next decade are still very good compared to many of its emerging market peers when they got, as a post-colonial societies, when they fell into economic crisis at any point since the end of the Second World War.
But I think the point is here that the disconnect in the country, which we've been speaking about a lot in this conversation, between, say, the elite, both in governing circles, in business itself, there is a lot of that kind of elite thinking, and well as elements of the legacy media. This idea of this ideology versus the practicalities of what people need, and the understanding that if we're going to move towards an economy that grows, because that's the critical point here, is the economic growth. If the economic growth can become 3, 4, 5%, then poverty is alleviated, then people have jobs, then that's the way forward. But there seems to be this blockage, and I think, maybe the VAT debate that was had was really masking something of the deeper problem, and that is the fiscus has run out of money, but they run out of money because the economy is not growing, and that fundamentally has to be dealt with. So let's say these trends are positive, but South Africa needs real change. And now the question is, how does a society, or how do people in society play a role in making that change happen? It seems that the ANC responds best to pressure, because you can show them all of these presentations, but until they go to 40%, and then the opinion polls put them at 30%, and then without Ramaphosa they're at 20%, then all of a sudden they're having a sober... It's even a lot like around this Israel discussion, sort of the ideological bias of the anti-Israel approach of the ANC government. It went against everything of the value system of this country and all of the national interest of this country, as the economic policies now are blocking the growth rate. So how do we get the ANC, or let's say this GNU, or the government operating in a way that is going to be for the national interest of this country?
I'd even go as far as, sometimes if an ANC person may come and see me and may say, what do you think is going on? And one of the things I say to them is, look, if you read the trends correctly, and the pressure, and respond to the pressure, we're going to talk about pressure, respond to it positively, I think it's quite straightforward that you can win the 2029 election. But if you continue to rail against the pressure that you're under and double down on radicalism, then you can never get back.
If you want to lose, basically the message...
If you want to lose, this is how you do it. This is
expropriation, NHI, employment equity, do all of that, and you're guaranteed of losing 2029.
This is why you lost the country.
Yes.
And this is why you will face...
Continue with the anti-Israel stuff.
Possibly complete political annihilation in the future. So you're under immense pressure. Pressure breeds reform is the rule. There's what we call the end of history delusion in the Western world, which came from the fall of the Berlin Wall. The sense in the West was it had triumphed, it had defeated the Soviet Union. The last threat to the Western liberal order had therefore gone away. And therefore hard power wasn't needed in politics or in diplomacy, international politics, to the extent it had been before, because the liberal democratic order would naturally spread around the world, and frankly we could just be nice to each other and find mutual common ground and understanding and conduct our politics on the basis of that. Now that was false. Again, it's an analytical mistake. All politics is about forcing a balance of power by creating pressure. There's no better lesson in that than some of the ANC's own historic and even contemporary strategy and tactics documents. And these, inspired, as you must understand, out of an old Cold War context, with ANC's herded into the arms of the East Germans and the Soviets by the stupidity of the Nats, who, after the Second World War, persecute what had been quite a moderate and centrist and pragmatic party, and then further try and build a growing economy whilst excluding 80% of people from participating in the benefits of the growth, which is a historical discussion. The ANC strategy and tactics documents, which have a lot of Soviet inspiration in them, Leninist inspiration, say you can advance the revolution. Remember the era this is cast in, when you meet with no resistance. But when you meet with resistance, you must step back. Not doing so, trying to press ahead in the face of resistance and pressure, there's a term for it. It's called left-wing adventurism in the ANC ranks, and it is seen as a sin, because if you press ahead in the face of determined opposition, you risk collapsing the entire revolution. which is exactly what the Ramaphosa administration of the ANC is now well in the throes of doing. Likewise, there's a flip side to it, that when you meet with no resistance, appeasement and indulgence, you must advance. And not doing so is equally a sin. It's called right-wing opportunism. And it means that you're not actually a real revolutionary. You're actually trying to build some kind of liberal democratic Western society, because you've got the opportunity to push revolutionary objectives, and you're not doing it because you've actually sold out on the question of the revolution. So within the ANC's own strategy and tactics doctrine, which is very appropriate for any young political leader or diplomat to read today on how to conduct global affairs, there is implicit in it this: under pressure, stop doing what you're doing, back off. Even if you wish to say it's a strategic retreat to lure your opponent into a false sense of security, you must back off. If you're an entity dealing with the South African government as far as that is the ANC or was the ANC, your approach must be informed by this too. Progress comes from the creation of pressure. Pressure doesn't mean being rude or abusive or offensive or anything of that nature. It means a sophisticated application of pressure, because inside the ANC camp, this will be tested at first. Is it real? Can we push through the pressure? If it's solid, then we must step back and negotiate. That works every single time. The VAT climbed down. The ANC rolled over by the DA on the question of VAT to the point of delaying the budget. The ANC had GNU alternatives, could have tried to kick out the DA, pass it with smaller partners. That works every time. And it's a complex argument. So some of my sort of colleagues who think about these things say, but if you pressure the ANC sufficiently now from the course that it's on, it could correct. And if it corrects, what happens then? And our answer is, well, then we think it goes back to 60% of the vote. Because the voters that have left it, for them, it was traumatic. These are people whose lives had been invested in the idea that the ANC would liberate them from the horrors that they were exposed to, bring dignity to them. And to be a former ANC voter and not vote for the ANC today is a very difficult thing to do. It's not an easy thing. If you put the ANC under enough pressure and it does reform, scores of voters, large percentages, will flow straight back into that party. Very happy to be able to vote for it again. So pressure applied to the ANC is not a set of actions that necessarily cause its further collapse, but might actually cause its recovery. And I've been, and this raises some eyebrows, on the record on a few other platforms. So there's nothing wrong with the idea of the ANC going back to 60% in South Africa and governing the country as it once did, because it can only get there and hold that number if it governs in a way that sees confidence lift of investors and therefore fixed investment from the 15% number up to closer to 25%, and therefore the rate of economic growth, and therefore the rate of job creation. So I'm perfectly comfortable telling an ANC person who might come and see me that it's not lost for you yet. You're very close to the end now and in terrible trouble.
Yeah, but the way to dig their hole deeper would be to double down on this ideological hard left positions on expropriation, Israel, employment equity, all of these things.
And in that case, then they may face further political losses and defeat. But where they placed, where this generates sufficient pressure.
So what you're saying is to get the economy moving again, we have to, that requires the common sense, pragmatic, moderate policies that have worked all around the world to generate economic confidence and therefore investment and therefore growth, and that's where all of business needs to step up. They often are very quiet in the face of these advances against them in the Expropriation Act, very quiet. NHI, all of these things, employment equity. If they should know, same as the courts and the Constitutional Court, they should know by pushing back against the ANC on these things, you actually have the people behind you.
Well, you have the people behind you, and you have the prospects of a stable majority government. Now, if that's not to be, and we're going to make a coalition government work in the country, that's what we're going to have to do. But it is a bit more difficult than being governed by a stable national majority. If you want South Africa to survive easily as a centrally directed state governed out of the Union buildings in Pretoria, it is going to be easier to do that with one party that wins a strong majority of votes. That could still be the ANC, but it can only be the ANC if that ANC replicates the confidence, fixed investment, growth and jobs numbers that it did in its first decade in power.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. We saw recent opinion polls putting the DA ahead of the ANC, even just marginally. I'm not saying those are necessarily going to hold, but it shows how fluid things. Didn't you discover in the SRF how many voters are uncommitted to anybody?
Yeah, we've seen what I'd sometimes describe, I think we've seen, if you look at the ANC voters, a crack. And that cracks at about a quarter of the ANC vote. So the ANC got 40% in the last election. A quarter of that's 10% of the electorate. There's a crack. And under the crack, the ANC people who for some time have been answering a lot of poll questions as if they are opposition voters. But they've been voting for the ANC. So why do you do that? And I think we know now. Many of those voters were very unhappy with the ANC, totally disgusted with it. That's not too strong a term. But they still voted for it, and there were reasons for that. One of those reasons was they said that if it loses its majority, there will be complete chaos and anarchy in the country. So we might as well vote for it, even reluctantly. The second thing they said is that the DA, if it was ever given a shot at national government, a significant share of those voters that are still in the ANC camp, if it was ever given a chance, it would almost certainly look to bring back apartheid. This is a consequence of the misinformation that's fed into the country by the mainstream media. And it's an appalling abuse of the country's people, for which the more holding to account needs to start to happen. The third thing is ANC voters said, well, all things being equal, we might as well vote for the winner because, maybe. And the fourth thing was that, well, at least Mr. Ramaphosa is there. So even if there's nothing else, we'll vote for him. But think of what has now happened. This is before the GNU. By the virtue of the fact of the GNU, voters have seen that there is no more chaos and anarchy than there was before. So a similar level of disorder. So that fear has dissipated, eroded. It's no longer a straw to cling to stay in the ANC. The second thing is the DA, certainly initially in government, was very meek and was easily rolled over by the ANC on a number of things, and there were concerns about that. But I think there was one advantage to the DA in that, is that put to bed the idea that the DA will set from day one off on rebuilding the sort of nationalist administration of 1948. So that fear is gone. The ANC is no longer winning. So you're not voting for the winner. That's gone. And Mr. Ramaphosa will also go. As a consequence, that quarter of the ANC vote that sat under the crack is beginning to detach from the greater whole and looking for something to do. Now, as I've said, the ANC, if it responds to the pressure it's under in the correct fashion, can win back, join the crack up, get back the voters that are already out, and can win 60% again, easily. But if they don't, that 10% starts looking for a new home. And then, as we go to 2029, we going to have the fascinating circumstance where the ANC from 40% makes an assault on 30%. It's going to do its very best to see if it can get to 30% of the vote. And the DA from, I think we got 22 in the last election, it starts, we've had it this year, 25, 26, 27. It's assaulting 30%. And depending on who succeeds Mr. Ramaphosa and the state of the economy and who the next DA leader is and all sorts of things that must still happen, you can now think about it. It's justified just to think about it. That might there be a situation where, come 2029, the ANC has fallen through 35, 34, 33, 32, and the DA has broken through 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. And do they even change places? That is, well, I'm not saying they will. We can't say now because the ANC still has enough time to respond to prevent that from happening. But it's exactly put the right way. Should it double down on what it is doing at the moment, it will so greatly continue to alienate what of its support remains that I reckon in the year out from the election, if you sit in a sort of South Africa strategy meeting with investors, one of the themes that's going to come up is come 2029, is the DA on top? Is the ANC on top? And what does that do to the power dynamic in the GNU that might be formed in the aftermath of that election?
Yes, but what you're basically saying, in either version of that, the people win because they want to get what they, their values put out there. But I think that the big challenge, say, to human dignity is this unemployment rate, and that's why this economic growth rate is everything. And so sort of all the pressure needs to be placed on the ANC as it is. I mean, it can't get enough money into the fiscus and, looking at tax increases. So to leave behind this hard left ideology, which is looking to expropriate land and confiscate this and nationalize that and doesn't understand the idea of attracting investors, and that hard left ideology is also what led it down the path of the anti-Israel thing and alienating it from the United States, from Israel, from the free world, and sort of lining up with Russia and China. So I think that in a way the economic policies, the mistaken economic policies, are also linked to this broader worldview where it's being driven by ideology and not by national interests.
Yeah, I think that's true on foreign policy. I think South Africa should replicate India's foreign policy. It shouldn't be, South Africa is a liberal democratic society, it should remain that. But it doesn't need to orient its foreign policy with hostile intent towards China or Russia. And become a bow and scrape to the West. I think foreign policy must be based on national interest, and South Africa is well positioned in the world to trade its geostrategic position for trade and investment advantages from the world's great powers, while remaining a liberal democratic society. But we can add this to the list. We've gone through expropriation, employment equity, NHI, VAT. Foreign policy is also aligned at odds with the interests and aspirations of South Africa's people. If you do the very simple test is to say there's a box of plane tickets that take you to your new home. The box on the left, the tickets are taking you to the West. Box on the right, they're taking you somewhere that's not the West. South Africans in great numbers pick the box that takes them to the Western world, because that is broadly...
That was an actual poll that you did in SRF.
That's broadly that's broadly the aspiration, is that kind of standard of living. But always we sound a bit of a cautionary note. Where the Western world itself starts to lose its way on questions of energy policy or the importance of merit in appointments, it's no longer possible, what might have been to some extent the case 30 years ago, to say, if in doubt, follow what Western capitals tell you to do. In terms of energy policy, South Africa would be much better advised to listen to Russia and China in terms of refitting its coal fleet, allow the energy production that will be necessary to power the investment lift from 15 to 25, the fixed investment lift. So it's no longer a neat, I think perhaps for liberal democratic thinkers 30 or 40 years ago, it was easy enough to say, if you're in doubt, go see what the West does and try and copy some variation of that. That's no longer the case. The South African government will have far more to learn about merit in the civil service by talking to the Chinese than it will learn from some past American administration. So the position is complicated to a degree. But the foreign policy needs to be essentially playing the great powers off, not in a silly way, but drawing advantages from both sides. But what we've had is an almost pathological alignment at odds with the interests of Western democratic societies. And we've paid a very heavy price for that. Part of that price is if you want to close the fixed investment gap, the United States, which is a bit behind the curve in terms of fixed investment in Africa and the like, is a very useful ally, particularly that of the Trump administration. The Trump administration will also give you the go-ahead to burn coal, which is what we have to do for the next 20 years to generate the electricity to liberate millions of people from unemployment. And anyone that argues to the contrary carries the responsibility of condemning millions of people to unemployment, because there is no green solution in that window in the next 10 to 20 years that can generate the quantum of dispatchable energy to make possible the absorption into employment.
You were one of the only people I know that predicted the end of the load shedding because of noticing the shift in policy to repairing the coal fleet.
Yeah. So that has to be done again. Now, the Trump administration will support that. The Trump administration is also a bit behind the curve on investment in Africa, as I've said, and the US economy is very large, and at 20 to 1, the dollar goes a very long way. And therefore, should South Africa's GNU want a shortcut to success, so we've stabilized the politics, we did the deal, these are all good things. The alternatives could have been truly destructive. How do you get this GNU from the 1% growth figure that it's now facing to the 3 to 4 to 5? The fastest way to do it is to go to Washington and say, can we do a deal? And how do we do that? And in that, isn't this a vast irony of things, given what mainstream sentiment is? That you could argue that should the ANC wish to recover, the only ally now that can get it there is being in the good graces of the Trump administration and doing a new trade and investment deal with South Africa.
Because that will force them into sane policies of growth around all of these critical issues that are blocking the economic growth.
You know, and Trump and Musk have been criticized a lot. They've been critical of property rights in South Africa. They've been critical of BE. They've been the South African media has savaged them accordingly. But if you go and talk to sensible people in America and you try and talk, well, what's the objective here? You get a very good answer. And the answer is, your country is important. It's a choke point, the Southern Sea Route, all these things. But if you want the US to commit to a relationship with South Africa, and what you're offering is a 30% unemployment rate and a 1% economic growth rate, there is no point in committing to you. Because you'll hold together for a time yet, I argue longer than I think some Americans believe. But inevitably, you will fall apart in some populist horror. Because you can't just maintain that level of inequality year in and year out into perpetuity. And therefore, if you want the United States to commit to South Africa, invest itself in building a relationship, then you need to remove the major constraints on growth. One of those, why your fixed investment levels are so low, is because you do threaten property rights. It is, and it's utter falsehoods to say that American policy on South Africa is made by reading some obscure Twitter accounts. as a chap put it to me, we did actually read your Expropriation Act ourselves. We saw what it said. We actually do it that way. And the second thing is you tax our investor capital on arrival. So if let's take the Starlink example. If Starlink wishes to be granted the privilege of investing in South Africa, it will first pay so much to whoever. Now that's South Africa's sovereign right, but the cost is that many countries, investors, pass you by. So the American argument saying secure property rights, don't tax American firms on arrival, are actually prescriptions that, if they were followed, would have the consequence of seeing South Africa become much more successful, living standards rising very quickly, and, we've hammered this point enough, maybe even the ANC restoring itself to power, but the ANC fights against us. The third issue just as I understand on the Americans, is normalizing relations with Israel. And I don't think you're going to get to a point where a trade and investment deal can be struck with the United States, where South Africa continues to position itself in a hostile fashion against Israel, and where South Africa is important. It's not so important that the US has no fallback positions. Both Namibia and Angola are fallback positions. A friend of sorts of mine who thinks a lot about these things on transatlantic partnerships, the thinking, which I would have hoped would be the US, the UK, Argentina, and South Africa. The first 3 years, but Angola is taking the place of South Africa.
Yeah, and that, you see, this is again where the government is going against national interests, and really this sort of alignment and re-establishing a proper relationship with Israel, both in terms of the morality of it, but in sheer politics and what the people want.
We're unique in some respects in Africa in this regard. I was struck on a recent visit there, to which I knew before, but just to hear it, that after Trump's initial tariff threats, he sent the sort of shots out around the world, that the response from a lot of Africa, Americans thought was extremely positive. I mean, Zimbabwe, just in a signal, said it would drop tariffs on American imports, which doesn't do much, but the signal was received. And likewise in other quarters, the Lesotho, little Lesotho, which some Americans have said they never heard of, had responded in a very positive fashion. But the great bulk of Africa's response to the US was positive, engaging. How can we come to terms that are to our mutual advantage? The standout exception, again, was the foreign policy practiced by the South Africans, which was extremely hostile, to the point of being offensive. And I mean, if you follow, people who watch this follow things, the expulsion of the ambassador, the departure of the consul from Los Angeles. And as we sit here today in May, there's not a single senior South African diplomat in America.
Yeah, and also there's no South African ambassador in Israel, and no Israeli ambassador in South Africa. That has to be rectified.
The normalization requires that from both sides.
Yeah,
I think, and I think both from the Israeli side, I think there is a risk, to an extent, that a view develops on the Israeli side that, look, is South Africa really worth it? And isn't it easier just to step away? And I think if the local South African Jewish community and those in the broader Christian community that care about Israel, if they wish to mitigate that risk, they've got to demonstrate very firmly that locally there is a very strong effort to resist and oppose the domestic threats that originate in South Africa to broader Western interests and to interest in Israel. And I think in your office that I've watched very closely for a number of years, one of the absolutely most critical things that you did is you demonstrated to Israelis that the local Jewish community is not going to just roll over, walk quietly away into the night. You're going to stand here and fight for a successful future for Jews in South Africa and by extension for all South Africans. Seeing that makes it very difficult for the naysayers, in as far as there are any, in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, to say just write the place off, evacuate it, it's a waste of time. So you've been very important there in securing the future. And just while I'm on the point, and I know that you got a lot of flack for this too, so I just want to add this too, that certainly after October the 7th, we've spoken at length today about how under pressure the ANC makes the mistake of doubling down on increasingly radical policies. One of the ideas was we can make Jews in South Africa the major target. We can really go after them hard. We can threaten, intimidate, stigmatize. We can cast them as an adversary, as an enemy, and use this to shore up popular support. The same misguided silliness of expropriation and the like. And there may have been a temptation to say, look, in the face of that, just go quiet, withdraw, don't counter it. Keep your heads down, do nothing. And your office, as I observed it, took the very interesting decision to actually stand up and say no, that we won't be cowed or intimidated. We will stand up. I will take steps to ensure the safety of the community. I will make strong arguments about why South Africa needs to normalize relations with Israel. What struck me particularly, your efforts at a parallel diplomatic channel as the ambassadors were departing from both sides and diplomacy was breaking down. And I think in that you might have single-handedly, to an extent, been responsible for the fact that if you look around the last couple of weeks, that hateful anti kind of Jewish rhetoric in South Africa is very much less from official sources, the government, the mainstream media, than it was 2 or 3 years ago, and that it would have been had the approach been simply to back off. And one of the case studies of pressure and its results will actually be what happened around the South African Jewish community in this office, where the very effective strategies that were followed have had the effect of greatly dampening this kind of anti-Semitic stigmatization of Jews rhetoric, and in fact taking us now to a point where it's possible to have a serious conversation about normalizing relations between South Africa and Israel, which is absolutely essential if South Africa's Jewish community is going to survive. It will be very difficult for it to survive if it is marooned and cut off from its connection to Israel. And I suppose then perhaps as we sort of wrap this to some extent, the theme is that the countervailing forces of a sensible populace and a free and open society, matched with the effective application of pressure, means that should that pressure continue in a constructive fashion, as it has, then there remains a very real prospect that South Africa, year after year, gets closer to a point where it can be a stable, a successful and prosperous society for all of its people.
Yeah. Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for your time. I think that was a very important point to end with, and I just want to sort of amplify it to all of those who are listening. I think the critical thing that has come out of this conversation that we've had is this idea that pressure makes a difference. And the reason it makes a difference in the South African context is because all the policies and actions South Africa needs to succeed and to thrive and to uplift and alleviate human suffering, which can only happen through a growing economy, through a civil service that is based on merit and not on favor. It's based on the best job you can do for the people of this country in hospitals and schools and in police stations. It's a vision that says millions of South Africans can be uplifted out of human suffering. The will of the people is there. The values of the people is there. This is what people really want for themselves and for their families and for the future. There is a remarkable convergence of interests, national interest, and the will of the people to really do better. But the policies of the current government are far from that. And so what's needed now, I think, is really a coalition of people across civil society, where it has to come from media and from business and from communities and from lawyers and from the courts, an understanding of the policies that are needed to help this country thrive, and an understanding that the people are right behind you in that. And that it's not about the ideologies of this government that are taking it on a path to political oblivion itself, and that the country needs to do better. But it will do better if we all join that struggle and fight and make our voices heard and have a sense to say, let's build a better country together. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank all of our listeners for listening in and being part of this conversation, and to Dr. Cronje for the remarkable work that you're doing for South Africa. And thank you for making your incredibly valuable time and insights available in this conversation, and to all of those who have joined in, and to our community who is really all of us, everybody, every South African. The thing that we need more than anything else is the knowledge, the insight, the framing of what's going on in the country, so that we can all make a difference and help get the country where it needs to go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.